My name is Kyoko Judy Hanazawa. My birth date is June 15th, 1947, and so I'll be 77 years old very soon. My profession in the past, before I retired, was as a social worker and social work supervisor. And in the last many years before my retirement, I was working in the area of Indigenous Child and Family Services. And I've been active in the Japanese Canadian community for the last 30 years or so. And my granddaughter is Sadie Momoko Hanazawa Root, and Sadie is interviewing me, and so this is our work together.
So our first question is, what was the common experience for families living in internment camps?
Well, a common experience is something that I can talk about remembering what my mother told me. And it was in the community of self-supporting community called Bridge River. Our family was there in a very roughly built house. It was cold in the winter, and my mother said that it was so cold that the ice formed on the inside of the walls, and there was very little insulation. It was pretty tough. There was no running water. People had to go and get water. At the time, my mother had a baby, a 1-year-old. And by 1943, when my middle sister was born, she was pregnant in that time that the family was in Bridge River. My middle sister was born as a tiny, tiny baby because she was premature. And my mother talked about the hardships living in Bridge River. My father was not always able to work because there was no work sometimes around the area. And so constantly the men in the community in Bridge River were looking for paid work to do. And there were times when they found something, like maybe a temporary period of time logging or something, but a lot of the time there was no work. And so finally, my family left Bridge River just before about 1946, and moved to Merritt, where I was born. But the time in the internment camp in Bridge River was a very, very difficult time. And my mother talks about it still, used to talk about it still, remembering how tough it was for her and how hard it was when she had my middle sister.
And our next question is, how was the experience for Japanese Canadians for rebuilding community after losing belongings, property, and money, and everything they had before the war?
It was very difficult coming back, but in our family, once my father found out that Japanese Canadians could go back to the coast after April 1st, 1949, he decided pretty quickly to go back to the coast and become a fisherman again, because that's what he was before the war. And we didn't say this before, but even his father was a fisherman. And there was a fishing community on the coast called Steveston, which is in Richmond, BC, where many Japanese Canadian fishing families lived. And so in 1949, when people could go back, the thinking was for many to go right back to Steveston and begin fishing again. But my dad instead decided that he would go to Vancouver and live in the old Japantown area called Powell Street in Vancouver, and begin his life and our family life after the war there in Vancouver. So that's what happened. The family came back to Vancouver in 1949, 1950. And it was very difficult all around because the first thing was to find a house, and that was difficult. But finally the family was able to rent a house, an old house on Powell Street. And eventually the Canadian Fishing Company started to rent out fishing boats to Japanese Canadians so that the men could go back into being fishermen again. And so from 1950 on, my father and a few of the other relatives in the family who were also fishermen began to go back into fishing. And it was many years of hardship because they didn't own their boats and they had to pay rent, and they were all contracted to be fishermen for the Canadian Fishing Company. But eventually, with my sisters going to school, me going to kindergarten, and our mother working again in a cannery because she worked for the Canadian Fishing Company, which was also in the neighborhood at the foot of Gore Street in Strathcona, Powell Street area. They just worked day and night very hard to try and pull their lives back together. It was a very difficult time. My sisters had to look after me. I was in kindergarten from the age of 3 on. I was in preschool kindergarten. And our father was away fishing and my mother worked in the cannery. It was a tough time. And my oldest sister was given a lot of responsibility to care for me and my other sister, because our mother was working hard in the cannery. So at the community level in Strathcona and Powell Street area, there was a little bit of a revival happening because a few other families also moved back to the area, which before the war was actually a really thriving business district for Japanese Canadian people. It was a very lively neighborhood with many Japanese Canadian families living in the area and many children attending Strathcona School. But all that was changed with the internment. And after 1950 on, it was a much smaller community. But the language school opened, the Japanese language school reopened, and the Buddhist temple reopened in the area. So there was slowly a rebuilding of community that was going on.
And our third question is the process of the redress movement in the 80s.
Well, the redress movement was actually something that had gone on for a good 10-year period. So discussion among Japanese Canadians to seek compensation for the injustices that they had experienced was a point of discussion from around the mid-70s at least. And, one of the things that really got people going was the beginning of what's called the Powell Street Festival, which is still something that happens every year now. And that started in about 1976, 77. And it was around that time that people began talking about the injustice of what happened and needing to get something from the Canadian government for going through everything the government did and then losing everything and losing our community. So during the 1980s, there was a long struggle within the national Japanese Canadian community. And there were differences of opinion in the community as well, because some people said, no, let's not get into that, and we just want to go on with our lives and not make people complain about Japanese Canadians. And we've done a good job getting back into regular life and regaining some standards of how we're going to be living and raising our families. And other people said, and many of them were the younger generations were saying, no, it was wrong what happened. We have to stand up and fight for justice and fight for redress. And so as the 80s went on, there was a political kind of development in the Japanese Canadian community for the community to seek redress from the Canadian government. And it was a struggle because many prime ministers and political parties in Canada were not supporting that. They were not, and they created a long, drawn-out fight for Japanese Canadians. But finally, in 1988, under the Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, there was a decision made that Japanese Canadians would get compensated. And it actually followed on a decision the year before in the United States by the President Ronald Reagan, who compensated Japanese Americans. And what was given was individual compensation in the United States of $20,000 for every person who was interned. And in Canada, there was actually, through the work of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, there was an actual agreement by the Government of Canada to compensate Japanese Canadians, not only for individual payment, which turned out to be $21,000 per individual born before 1949, but as well a community fund and the funding towards what's today known as the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And that Race Relations Foundation was a requirement coming from the Japanese Canadian community to set up a foundation so that racism would not be able to make people suffer in any other community. So that was the thinking of Japanese Canadians at the time, that justice meant individual compensation, community compensation, and developing a foundation which would really support and promote anti-racism.
So our last question is, how did the incarceration affect future generations of Japanese Canadians, such as mental health effects and family relationships?
And that's a big question to answer, but it's a really important one because my thinking is that the effects were really, really deep. And family life was really severely affected, and there was harm. There was harm to intergenerational family life. Many, many Japanese Canadian families tried to manage what happened to them by stopping talking about it. And that's a fact in our family too, because my mother and father didn't really talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it. They just thought it was important to get on with working hard to rebuild their lives. And nobody wanted to go back to remember all the different experiences and hardships and cold houses and no work and all the feelings they had in the past of not knowing what was going to be ahead of them in the future and losing everything they had before being driven away by the Canadian government. So it was very difficult for them to handle the emotional hardship of what they went through. So they stopped talking. They didn't talk about it. So us children didn't get the story, and parents tried very hard. Many parents tried very hard to be strong and think of the future for their children and just work hard to make a good future. But what happened was that left a big gap in the children's selves about their own story. They didn't know their family story, and so they had sort of this foggy notion about what their lives, what their mom and dad's lives were, their grandparents' lives. And it really caused some sort of challenges in families about being open, and allowing the emotional feelings about a difficult experience to be shared with one another. And so many families and many younger generations say, and you hear this among young people who are probably now in their 20s, 30s, who say, well, my mom and dad never talked about it, so I didn't learn enough about my own family. And I feel like I have a kind of a gap in my own family story. And so this kind of difficulty really affects a person's identity when you don't know your whole story. And I think that's one of the hardships within families that resulted from this history we have of being incarcerated, of having everything taken, and going through so many years of not knowing what lies ahead in the future, and just struggling to survive. And so there were many ways that families were challenged. One of them being that in many families there were older children whose education stopped, because once they were 14 or 15 during the internment, they had to help their parents, and so they worked. They dropped school and they worked. And so you'll find in many Japanese Canadian families, with the oldest children in the family, there is a lack of education, maybe grade 9 education or so. And then with the younger members of family, and by the time the 1950s came along, it was the younger members in families who were able to finish high school and maybe go on to university. And so this was all of the different kinds of experiences of families that made it very difficult to be emotionally stable and to be able to be freely open and share communication about all kinds of things that families know about each other and talk openly. These kinds of things in some families were not easy. And so over the generations, as the younger generations and grandchildren have grown up, like Sadie has, these are things that are not very understood, because I think children grow up more now with things being out in the open and being able to talk and share when something's a concern. And it wasn't so easy in Japanese Canadian families to be open like that. And I think that that's a direct result of this history. And so there are many challenges. And yet now, because the younger generations are saying, we have to be open, we have to open things up in our families, the older generations are listening and saying, yeah, you're right. It's really important to have this ability to be freely talking about things with one another. And I think that that's a good thing now. It's so, it's really making me feel, as a grandma to Sadie, to feel like there's a pride in seeing that this is able to happen, that we can talk about stuff. I can talk about this story, and even talk about how the challenges existed about sharing feelings. And it's something that it is something that my two sisters and I, and we're all, they're in their 80s and I'm in 77 soon. We still have those kinds of things that we struggle with a little bit. And that's just the way it is. But one good thing is that when you start talking about history and the effects, it helps because that openness is really important. And being emotionally able to express yourself is really important. And I think this is a good way to end my talk. So thanks.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to come over and to be interviewed, and for educating me more on our family.
Oh, you're welcome, Momo. Thank you for inviting me.
And that's all for our interview today.